And we're back. Lawmakers in the Carolinas have been meeting to discuss what to prioritize this legislative session. Some representatives are considering laws that would limit how teachers tackle history in the classroom. More than a dozen states across the country now have laws on the books about critical race theory in public schools. Joining us right now to give his input on the conversation is Dr. Hassan Crockett. He's the Dean of Liberal Arts and Humanities at Livingstone College. Good morning, Dr. Crockett.
Good morning, Casey Jones, and how are you today?
I'm doing great. So, why do you think some representatives are trying to limit the way schools teach race and history?
Okay, well, first, let's get a clear understanding of critical race theory. I like to use the medical history analogy. One of the first things your medical doctor asks you when you visit the doctor is, what is your medical history? Because a family's medical history may show a pattern of certain diseases in the family. Now that you know what your medical history is, and maybe you have cancer or diabetes, what do you do about it? Do you keep smoking cigarettes? Do you keep eating sugar? So let's look at that analogy as we look at our community, our nation as a family. We know that there is a history there, and it's not based on individuals. It is based on our history. So therefore, what do we do once we find out that we have a pattern of inequality, a pattern of discrimination, a pattern of unjust systems within our nation? Do we keep smoking cigarettes? Do we continue the pattern, or do we try to remedy it? So I think that one of the things that you're talking about is when you look at the state legislatures, a lot of it's fake news. For example, Bill, I think it's 4477 in South Carolina. They introduced the bill and they said that critical race theory is based on the family. I mean, based on the individual. It is not based on the individual. It's a systemic approach. In North Carolina, the bill that was introduced last year by the state legislature, Republican-led state legislature, they said the same thing. It is not individual, it is systemic. So we have to approach it from a systemic viewpoint and not from an individual being blamed for what has happened in the past, just like our medical history.
Sure, that makes a lot of sense. You know, like you just kind of got into, critical race theory is very complex, advanced, nuanced. It's taught in higher education or law school. So how did every conversation about race or slavery turn into critical race theory? Where do you think that comes from?
It's part of, I think, the cultural wars that we're having. Uh, when we teach ideology, one thing, it explains ideology, explains, it evaluates, it orientates, and it has a program. So if you're trying to explain what's going on in the world, you can use an ideology that says what's going on in the world is something that is based upon only slavery, based upon only the individual being wrong, only the individual having a critical part within the actual causes of slavery, the actual causes of racism, the actual causes, but it's not the individual based. It is part of a system again. So when you try to evaluate it, ideology says, well, it's wrong. Or orientation, you have an identity. You say, well, I am white, therefore I do not like people saying that I am the cause of racism. And then you have a program. A program says we will pass laws that make that makes critical race theory illegal, that makes critical race theory harmful to our children, and et cetera. So it is part of the whole cultural wars that we're having, and it is not based in fact, it is actually based in fake news.
Yeah, and the Florida governor has been questioning the educational value of the AP African American History course. That's a course that's taught right here in North Carolina. So what the Florida governor is doing, is that something that we should be concerned about here in the Carolinas?
Yes, I really can't understand what DeSantis is saying. He says that he's rejecting the advanced placement course on African American studies because, and I quote, it is the study of queer theory and the political movements that advocate for, quote, abolishing prisons. He says it has a political agenda. And that's the basis for his dispute with the AP course that's being taught or would be taught in South Carolina, in Florida. So the thing about critical race theory, and I think we should note that it is not only a theory that addresses or the systematic discrimination against people of color, but you can also look at how you have the discrimination against people for their gender, for their racial preferences, ageism, immigration, the nationality, and systemic being the fact that it prevents them from advancing in, say, housing, in jobs, in education. So you have all of those different types of systems that prevent groups within our society from advancing the way other groups, particularly the white group, advances in our society. So when he talks about this, he identifies it and says that it is the study of queer theory. And so he has a different take on the AP course. But I think he makes a good point that when you talk about systemic systems that influence and that impact certain groups, they could be the queer groups, they could be the age groups, they could be immigrants, and et cetera. And when it becomes systemic, it holds them back from advancing the way other groups in our society advance.